In this lecture, I am going to discuss a little bit about the theory of evolution, and the first one is kind of a joke that we see in this figure here, pointing out how mankind, or Homo sapiens, has evolved from some of our ancestors out there, and you can see that it looks like we're devolving back to this hunched over kind of creature. But if we take a look at this idea and think about why are there so many different organisms on the planet that have some similarities, this is something that biologists were really intrigued about over the last 100 years as more and more of them started to really travel around the world and get a look at all these different kinds of organisms. And in this example, we can see what is known as the mantid. And you can see if you look at these three different examples, these are all similar kinds of organisms, but you notice they have similar kinds of body architecture, but very distinct coloration right here. And so this would be one of those kinds of questions about how did these animals evolve to really have similar characteristics and yet be so different when you look at that visual thing right there. And if we go back and look in history, we can see some of the early models for evolution are kind of interesting. And one of them was done by a Frenchman that he proposed this model in the early 1800s, and we refer to this as the use and disuse model. And basically what he proposed, and this is demonstrated with our little cartoon over here of some giraffes, is that you have an ancestor species out there of giraffes. And some of these giraffes were eating low-lying shrubs, and so these giraffes did not develop a long neck. But the ones over here on the right side, these are ones that were using this higher up plants out there, and because they were stretching out, they started to acquire certain kinds of characteristics. In this case, they acquired a much longer neck. And then his model for evolution is that this trait that these animals had acquired during their lifetime would get passed on to their offspring. So the ones over here on the left had a shorter neck because they were really not reaching as far to get to their food, whereas these ones over here are going to have a much longer neck because they are reaching up for higher food that's out there. And so if you think about this idea, this is a very intriguing idea that characteristics could be acquired during your lifetime and passed on. But to give you sort of a comparison, think about if you see somebody who is a weightlifter, they are definitely acquiring those muscles during their lifetime. But does that mean that their baby is going to pop out of mom with these huge muscles on them? And we know nowadays that this is not true, that you cannot acquire these characteristics during your lifetime. You might be able to change them, but they are not really built into your genes and inherited by your kids. And if we look at this one, this figure is really an interesting idea because this is starting to get into the mid-1800s. And Darwin, on his trip around the world, when he stopped off in South America, he was looking at the birds that were there. And he observed that the beak shape actually differed amongst various finch species. So when you look at the characteristics, these finches all had similarities in terms of their overall body architecture, but there were some very distinct differences that you would find amongst the breeding species, and they would pass on these characteristics to their children. And because of his observations, he came up with a hypothesis. His hypothesis was that the ancestral species out there adapted over time. So certain changes were occurring in these finches, and then those changes would get passed on, allowing their kids to acquire different kinds of food sources. So you're really looking at what Darwin considered a tree of life. In the base of the tree, you have the ancestor, and then their children diverge. And a really interesting example is that we do actually see an example of how populations change in the Galapagos Islands in the 1970s. There was a drought on one of the islands where these finches were, and what they found was that the drought actually resulted in fewer small seeds being available to the finches, and a lot of these small-beaked finches died off. They didn't have the food. And so if you think about how this population changed, there was an increase in the average beak size of the finches there because of their environment. And so this hypothesis is actually borne out by some experimental evidence that was collected more than 100 years after Darwin was down there. So if we take a look and think about this, what was going on with Darwin, really there's two key observations that he made that did lead to his theory of evolution. One of those observations is that when you look at a population of organisms that are out there, the individuals within that population are going to vary. And we can see that. Look around at people. You see that we all share a lot of similarities, but there are individual variations amongst all the people in the population. And this is really important for our theory of evolution because when you look at a population of organisms, there are a lot of traits out there that can be influenced compared to when you're just looking at individuals. Think about your family members and then compare them with people that you run into on the street. Your family is going to be more similar to you than other people that you would run into. So we've got all these individuals out there in a population that can breed. And one of the problems that biologists know about is that when you look at a population of organisms, you tend to have too many kids. All species that are out there seem to do this kind of feature there. You try to have as many kids as possible. For us, we tend to limit that a little bit, but you can still see some exceptions to that rule. And if you put these two observations together, that you've got a population of individuals that vary, and within that population you've got people that are having too many kids, this is going to lead to what we call a struggle for resources. You're going to be fighting with these other individuals in order to get enough food and water and living space so that you can have more and more kids out there. And the conclusion that Darwin drew is that this led to natural selection, that there was unequal reproductive success going on. And again, it's not necessarily that the strong are the ones that survive. When we look at this idea, it's the individuals that are best adapted to their environment that can win that struggle for resources. They're the ones who are going to have enough energy, they're going to have enough food and water and living space to be able to win this battle of unequal reproductive success. And when we look at this idea here, the modern idea of evolutionary theory is that we can divide it sort of into two different classes. One class of it is known as microevolution. And if we look along the bottom of this figure, we can see that you have these lizards here, and there is a little bit of change going on in the population, but it's a small change. Maybe these lizards are going to change in size. Maybe they're going to change in color right here. This is changes that are occurring, but they're small, gradual changes. And when you look at macroevolution, this is a related thing. This is where the sum of these changes right here are going to add up and give you a totally different kind of individual out there. So when you look at macroevolution, it's taking a whole bunch of these small changes, and that's giving rise to a new species. And when you have a new species here, this bird is not able to breed successfully with these lizards over here. So this is, again, that idea on how do we get diversity. All of these different organisms that are out there, how did they come about? And this is what we look at with evolutionary theory here. And when we look at this idea, we have to go back and think about what you've learned. When you look at a population of organisms, they share common traits. And remember, those traits are determined by your genes. And so when we look at evolutionary theory in modern times, now we have to start looking at what's known as gene pools, which is really the collection of all of these alleles that you find in a population at any one time. So we could look at human species and look at all these different kinds of genes and traits that we have available and start to do some examinations on different kinds of organisms that are out there, not only ourselves, but other ones. And when we look at this idea, unfortunately, it uses some math. And so when we consider this idea, how do we analyze these gene pools? Well, if you think about it, when you look at alleles, you have a dominant and you have a recessive, don't you? Well, if you look at this, we could go out and look and measure the frequency of one allele and the frequency of another allele that's out there. And those two frequencies, the number that we see in a population, should add up to 100%. And so take this one step further. Take that gene pool, that reservoir for all these genes that are out there, and start to look at the frequency of these genes in the population. So say you went out and you counted the frequency of traits. You were looking at hair color or something like that, and you measure this. Maybe you go out to a field of flowers and you look at them, and you have done some previous work where you know this is the dominant trait and this is the recessive trait. Well, you could go out to that field of flowers and count the number of flowers that have the dominant. Think about Mendels experiment, purple versus white flowers. You could take a whole field of them and count the number of them and say, hey, look, 70% of the flowers that I counted have that dominant trait right there. And if you know that 70% of them have it and you're looking at a field, that's your 100%. So we could just manipulate this P plus Q equals 1 and figure out Q, or you could actually count those. And look, 70% of them are dominant, 30% of them are recessive. And then we can go back and think about what we learned when we were looking at Mendel's genetic characteristics in the Punnett square. Think about if you took a monohybrid cross where you had some heterozygotes and you plug those things in, you did meiosis where you segregated those alleles right there. Think about these are each gametes, and then you have fusion of those gametes to give you your zygote. And remember our different classes: homozygous recessive, homozygous dominant, and then you've got your heterozygote classes out there. Well, what if we use this idea of the frequency of these alleles in a population and start to analyze these gene pools? So now we can take that and plug in our frequencies from those population counts that we did. Again, think about our flower example with purple and white flowers here. The frequency of the dominant allele was 70%. So if you think about that, there's your dominant allele right there. That's your 70% on either side of our Punnett square right there. We would expect 70% of the eggs or the sperm or whatever gametes are going to have that dominant allele coming out of that population. And likewise, 30% are going to have that recessive allele. So we plug this into both sides and we do our fertilization of our egg, and we take these two alleles and combine them. That means we combine those probabilities. So right there, the chances of getting this particular individual right here, we learned from Mendels Genetics, that's 25%. But now we're throwing in this extra thing. We're looking at the frequency of that allele in the population. So the chances of that occurring are going to be the chances of either allele being in the population. So 70% times 70% right there. And the same thing holds true for our heterozygous classes, but we have to take into account our recessive trait and then our homozygous recessive population. We have to look at the frequency of that allele in the population. So if you take this and think about what's going on in each of these boxes here for our Punnett square, now we can take a look at the frequencies of that genotype in your population right there. The frequency of these two alleles coming together and forming this individual. So there it is right there. It was that 70% times 70%, or we can just write it as the probability of that one allele that was there as a dominant is squared right there. So now we've got P squared. We have two boxes right here where it was the probability of P and the probability of Q. So there's our PQ, and then there's two of those. And then we take a look at this one over here. What's the probability of both recessive alleles being in that population of individuals? There's your Q squared. And this is what's known as the Hardy-Weinberg formula. And if you take a look at the Hardy-Weinberg formula, there's a very interesting principle that comes out of this. Notice, if you start out with a really high proportion of your homozygous recessive, that Q squared at 100%, you're going to have 0% for your other classes. And as this homozygous recessive individuals drop in your population, you would expect to see an increase in the amount of that dominant allele appearing in your population. And look what happens to your heterozygous. You see this weird kind of cone or curved shape right there. If you think about what's going on with this Hardy-Weinberg principle and these equations, this is telling us about that gene pool within the population. And there's a really famous kind of thing about Hardy-Weinberg principle. When you're looking at a population that is not evolving, they are in equilibrium, and these numbers do not change from one generation to the next. So evolution is really a change in the frequency of alleles and genotypes within a population.